Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner, and here we are going to deliver a lecture on environment protection and sustainable development in comparative constitutional perspective. The Constitution is the paramount law of the land, and therefore it is very important for us to look at how the Constitution of India vis-a-vis the Constitution of different countries in the world have reacted to the issue of the environment protection and sustainable development. It is generally said that the constitutional law of any country dates back to at least prior to 1972 Stockholm Declaration. And as we know that the very notion and concept and theory and the practice and its legal incorporation of sustainable development came in 1970s and 80s. But there are many countries which have their own constitution and have provision about environment protection and sustainable development. And there are countries where it has witnessed more insertion and incorporation of environment protection and sustainable development in their constitution. So, we are going to explore how the question of environment and sustainable development has been approached by the constitutional perspective. And then we are going to do in this lecture, not in the Indian context, but we are going to draw a comparative constitutional perspective to buttress this point that how there has been a kind of an atmosphere across the statutory rehabilitation and the constitutional rehabilitation to see that every constitution of the world have at least some provision, whether it is express verbis or it is something directly or indirectly, it has touched upon the vital issue of the environment protection and sustainable development in their constitution. With this, the synopsis of this lecture, dear learner and viewer, will be looking at that before the constitutional law have engrafted the provision relating to environment protection, number one, and the sustainable development as number two, it is very appropriate for us to look at the entire panorama of international environmental law and then how this environmental law principle which has been deduced by the international conferences in the Stockholm Declaration, in the World Charter for Nature, in the Rio Declaration, and subsequent series of conventions, guidelines, framework convention, protocol, recommendation to buttress this point that how in the world constitution or the constitution across the world of we find some reference of intergenerational equity, environmental assessment, international cooperation, differentiated, common but differentiated responsibility, common heritage of the mankind, all tender concern, and all the theories and practice and all the basic precepts of the sustainable development have in one way or the another way handed down by the international environmental law have been inserted into the constitution across the globe. In this respect, we will be referring to the expert group on environmental law recommendation 1986, which has been partly reflected in the appendix of the Birkeland Commission, which is popularly known as the World Commission on Environment and Development expert group on environmental law, and they have deduced 22 principles to give emphasis and impetus to the question of environmental protection and as well as the sustainable development. Having looked at the entire international environmental law and its basic precept in relation to environment protection and sustainable development, we'll be looking on the implementation of the environmental commitment and how the countries in the different nook and corner of the world have reacted and responded to the call and the clarion call of the environment protection and sustainable development in their constitutional law, becoming saying that it is one of the most strongest medium to enforce environmental ethics, moral, and it tries to give some kind of a rights and duty discourse. In this reference, the India's constitution has also drawn a very strong statutory framework which reflect the international commitment vis-a-vis it has embedded the ancient Indian philosophy and the deep theological or deep ecological movements which the India has witnessed in the annals of the history in the ancient India, in the medieval India, and the modern India. With this, we'll be also looking at that how sustainable development question have been addressed and focused and emphatically led down for reform in the constitutional law and the precept and the practice across the globe after the Stockholm Declaration, the Rare Declaration 1992, and how gradually and slowly and perpetually that these principles of environment protection and sustainable development have acquired a status of jus cogens, and it has become the currency in the international environmental law in particular and international law in general to see the environment and sustainable development as a broader part of the jus cogens, and the sustainability is something the hallmark which remains at the center of all the lawmaking in the contemporary world. We will also be looking at this point that what are the enforcement of environmental law principle. Having outlined these synopsis, what we will try to do, that we will be going and discussing in detail each and every component and the contours of the very essence of the environment protection and sustainable development in comparative constitutional perspective. And in this reference, we are going to see the enforcement of environmental law principle, that how it has provided a kind of a movement and generated a deep impact on the constitutionalization of environment across the globe. Dear learner and viewer, in this respect, we are going to see that what is the corpus of the international law and what is the corpus of international environmental law, and the corpus and the jurisprudence which have been meticulously been imposed and recommended by the expert group of the environmental law of the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1986, how these principles are going to be translated in legal arena, especially statutory law and as well as the constitutional law. In this reference, what we see that there are certain basic principles of incorporation, and here the principles of environmental law which remains in the center, that how it is going to reflect in the constitutional goal and the vision of the country. The first and foremost, it happens to that it tries to see that how constitution can be a basic and fundamental parchment and document to see that international and intergenerational equity can be promoted. And it talks about not only because, as we know, the very notion and concept of equality which encompasses the present generations and does not take into account the generations to come. But for the first time in the legal domain, because of the international environmental law discourse, that we have come across intergenerational equity, and which tries to see the sense of equality not in the present generation but in the future generation, and going one step forward and taking a very quantum leap, that it does not talk only about the equality, but it generally talks about the equity. And then any common sense of the law reveals that the equity is a more broader concept, and which is something above, stands on the highest pedestal of the equality. So far, all the constitution of the world have tried to establish the equal protection of the law and equality before the law among the present generation, but it is supposedly a kind of a quantum leap, and that's why we say that it talks about not only intra but intergenerational equity. And then in this intra and intergenerational equity is to be promoted by the certain principle, and the one principle happens to be the prevention is better than cure, is that is precautionary principle, which has been adopted by the world community and has been translated in the European Economic Convention and under Article 135, and it has been permeated across all the environmental statute. Vis-a-vis, some of the Constitution has been also very sensitive to incorporate the principles of caution and neighborliness, and so that the transboundary movement of any kind of a hazardous waste or the pollution should not invade to the labor to the neighbors. And then concomitant to the principles of principles of precautionary principle, there is a principle of polluter pays principle, which we have already discussed in some of the lectures when we were following the international law relating to the environment and sustainable development. So what is the basic principle? That one is the precautionary, another is the preventive polluter pays principle, and the principle of the preventive action, that is restraint, neighborly, good neighborliness, and to see the one who bring the hazardous substance and the hazardous material in their premises alone has the capacity to understand the hazards, and therefore the preventive action, whatever happens to be, it is incumbent and the onus lies on the person who bring the hazardous substances and material in their domain to see that it does not escapes out and cause damages to its neighbor, and the neighbor may be individual or the region or the state or the countries. In this sense, we see that all three have an interrelationship, be that precautionary principle, be that the principle of preventive action, be that the polluter pays principles, and then we find that there is a principle of integration, meaning thereby that the principle of integration talks about that either we have a dualistic world order or we can have a monistic legal order. In whether we have a dualistic kind of a legal order or a monistic kind of a legal order in the framework of the Kelsen or the Kelsenite framework of the law. And then we try to see that there is a merger and there is a constant interaction, and then there is a constant integration of the principle, or that the principle of integration try to see that the international environmental law and as well as the national environmental law can have a kind of a meeting point, barring few congenialities which are required in a particular territorial jurisdiction. Nonetheless, the law remains one and the same, and the essence and spirit remains the same, and thus is the principles of environmental law, which promotes environment protection and as well as sustainable development. In this respect, we will try to see that how this principle has finally been translated into the legal arena, and then it has identified that these legally deduced principles on environment conservation and sustainable development is finally which have been reflected and touched upon in the Butland Commission report on environment and development in 1987, how it goes well, the idea in permeating the entire constitutional conspectus of the different countries of the world. Then before we do that, we try to see that what has been ordained by the World Commission on Environment and Development, expert group on environmental law, then what are the principles, and then what are the nature of the right, and what are the content of the right, and that has to be inserted into the Constitution. To this end, dear learner and viewer, we will try to read a comparative perspective of the nature of right and the content of the right in, and then the nature of the right says that there is a fundamental human right. And once we talk that there is a fundamental human right, and it is easy to speak in the vocabulary of the rights and the language of the rights, and saying that it is fundamental, saying it is human right to have environment protection and sustainable development, but to see very categorically and critically that how this fundamental human right, the the nature of the right happens to be not only the statutory, not only legal, but it is going to be fundamental, it is going to be inalienable, it is going to be the human right. Then we will also try to we should rather try to understand that by saying that the fundamental human right, what exactly we mean, what it does connote and denotes, then we see that what this document of 1987 tries to cull out is the fact that all have the fundamental right to an appropriate environment for human health and clean life. And then this is the broader parameters to be tested upon, that what is the fundamentalness and the fundamental character of the environmental right as a human right, that there must be an appropriate and congenial atmosphere and environment which is which can promote a very robust human health and a clean life. Then the other part of this principle happens to the intergenerational equity, which talks about that the present generation has a right to development without compromising the needs and aspirations of future generations to develop their aspiration and expectations of life in their own way. So there should not be any kind of a compromise between the present and the future generation, as the present generation is not only the repository and the depository of the natural resources, and the present generation is not supposed to exhaust its natural resources on their own, but try to have a kind of a judicious husbandry to see that these resources are being inherited by the future generations, or the present generation is trying to bequeath those natural resources for the future generation. And that intergenerational equity, the content aspect or the ambit and scope aspect happens to be that the state shall conserve and use the natural resources, taking into account the competing sets of claim of the present and the future generation. Then the third principles on the nature of right, which emerges out of the perusal of the 22 principles which has been laid down in 1987, happens to be the conservation and sustainable use, and that it is twofold. The first aspect is the conservation, another aspect is the sustainable use. So it should combine, it should not only have a emphasis on conservation, but the conservation and sustainable use will go hand in hand, and then only we can maintain the ecosystem for the environment. The other principle which happens to be in the nature of right, which have been deduced out of determination and monitoring of environmental quality, because once we talk of the human health and the clean life, then it requires a monitoring of environmental quality. And to this end, we see that environmental law is mercilessly dependent on the standards. And the standard means the water quality, the air quality, the environmental quality, the noise level, and all kind of the parameters and the benchmarks which has been created to assess that what is environmentally suitable and what is environmentally damaging, and that requires a determination of monitoring and as well as environmental quality. And it talks about not only the protection of standards, but it also talks about the quality and the resource use. And therefore, it requires a kind of a mammoth administration to monitor and to be engaged continuously to see the quality of the environment is not going to be compromised in any way that can endanger the human health and the clean life. The other principle happens to be the environmental assessment and evaluation. This is something, an inbuilt concept, that is, it is not only that when the project or the industries have been established for the industrialization, and then only we can have some kind of the laws which can be applied. But this is the environment impact assessment principle is not an ex post facto law, meaning thereby right from the stage of the planning, right from the stage of organizing, right from the stage of developing, it is the proponent of the developer should take a continuous and prior environmental assessment and to assess in a very judicious manner, in a very careful manner, to see that it may have what are the potential and what it is going to have the impact on all all aspect of the environment, the totality of the environment that has to be taken in the environmental assessment and evaluation system. Then the other principle which come across out of this principle is the prior information and access and due process. All these determination of the environmental quality, or you can say the environmental assessment and evaluation, it is dependent on a massive information sharing and access and the due process of participation of all stakeholders among the administrative echelon, judicial echelon, and as well as the state and the people. So it requires a kind of not only a top-down approach, but from the below, from the middle, and as well as the top-down approach, so that we can have the enforcement of environmental law principle in a environment and as well as sustainable development manner. So then the very idea of sustainable development which has been permeated requires some support, and that support should not be feeble but very strong support, and it requires some kind of an assistance, and therefore the state should always ensure that the conservation remain an integral part of the implementation planning. It's not an add-on, it's not a kind of an exercise that you have to have some kind of a shallow commitment to the environment, but it should be integral and inbuilt in the entire sphere of the implementation of the plan and development activities. And then the international obligation and cooperation in relation to the environmental law can be actualized. Then what we see that the very enforcement of the environmental law principle requires that the environmental rule should not be the part of the constitution, but they are unenforceable in legal practice, meaning thereby they are inalienable, and that inalienability of environmental right has to understand into a right context. We can have fundamental right, we can have human right, but the very essence of the inalienable character and the inalienability of the environmental right, that has to be seen in the entire spectrum and the framework and the entire thinking of the environmental rule in the constitutional making in any nation's constitution. Therefore, what it requires that it could go, the growing ecological crisis which we are facing, and we are trying to repose confidence in the environmental protection, or we are going to repose confidence into the constitutional commitment, then that commitment should not be only a kind of a right-based approach, but that commitment must have some component of the constitutional duty and as well as is the right, and then it can perfectly go, as Professor Kerr has rightly pointed out, that the right to clean and healthy environment is not a luxury but a necessity for human survival, and therefore it requires a the environmental rights should deserve constitutional recognition. But at the same time, we see that how the United States Constitution has responded to the question of the environmental right and the constitutional recognition. We see that it in a very unmistakable term, it has laid down that the quality of the life or the right to life and assertion of the right to life well stands as a sacrosanct right. Nonetheless, each person has a right to clean air, pure water, and productive soil, and at the same time, the conservation of the natural resources, scenic beauty, historical, recreational, aesthetic, and economic values of America's natural resources is also a kind of a pious obligation, and that pious obligation rests with all the generations of American, be that the present generations, be that the future generation. So assertion of right is one aspect, that the one aspect is here, and the another aspect that the conservation of the natural resources as a larger part of the duty is also very important in giving fillip to natural, scenic, historic, recreational, aesthetic, and economic values of the environment and sustainable development. In that reference, we see that United States Constitution states that the state will be the trustee of all of the natural resources, and then the doctrine of parent patrie, which has always been applied in the international law or in the national law, that reposing that unless the state assumes that role of the public trustee, the very object of the intergenerational equity is not going to be fulfilled, because what we try to do, whether it is a right or a duty, what we have to do, that we do not inherit the earth from our ancestor, we borrow it from our children. So therefore, if that remains the spirit, then we can understand that the very notion of the intergenerational equity that has not to be compromised, and right and duty goes along with. In this reference, what we see that the 1972 Stockholm Human Conference, which declared fundamental human right to environment, then we see that there has been a fresh wind and a kind of a spring which we have witnessed, a constitutional spring we have witnessed after that. And the constitutional spring it that over 100 constitutions of the world, 100 constitutions of the world, and this is what I term as the spring of the constitution, and the spring of that it has a very ripple effect, and in shaping the constitution of the world, and more than 100 constitutions of the world worldwide now, a cursory glance we can see that right to healthy environment have been a sacrosanct human right or fundamental right, and that talks about not only a global shift, but it is said to be a kind of a paradigmatic shift or in matters of enforceability of the constitutional norm. Therefore, what we see in geography, in history, and all kind of the resources, now there is a kind of a commitment to the sustainable environment as an essential for human dignity and development as a goal of the state, where the state figures out as the public trustee of all the natural resources. With this, what we see that the Gaylor's interdisciplinary study on the constitution and constitutionalism have handed down and have already set out that the law, political science, sociology, and then it tries to see that from all disciplinary angle how the countries adopted environmental right into their constitution, sometime by the pressure of law, expediencies of law, and expediencies of the sociology and anthropology and the societal compulsion. We see that the environmental rights into their constitution, and then it has created a kind of an atmosphere which can really be served as a domestic advocacy, and it has internationally influenced the entire spectrum of the constitutional law making. And then what we feel is the aspect that wherein we can say that the environment and sustainable development is a kind of a paramount goal which we have. And then in Indian aspect, we see the environmental justice question which is looming large in the entire discourse of the environment protection as well as sustainable development is not a slogan but a condition for survival, as has been mentioned by Justice V.R. Krishna here. And then it is important more so to act locally and think globally, and then this kind of an alliance give rise to a kind of an implementation of the environmental commitment by a kind of an evaluation, by kind of a review, by kind of a constitutional planning, and then having a robust implementation system of the environmental right to express environmental values and ethics for citizens and non-citizens. And in this context, what we see that India has also played a very pivotal role in international environmental commitment, vis-a-vis incorporation of the conservation of natural resources and sustainable use of the resources, right from the modern set of the legal principles and discourse, and as well as from the traditional sources of which the Indian philosophy of having the deep ecological concerns have also been visited into the entire spectrum of the constitutional law making. The implementation of the environmental commitment right from 1952 50 to 1920 2020 reveals that most notably the India happens to be very active participation, and the very idea of sustainable development have been carried forward in the very parameters and precincts of the constitutional law, and now it has been taken that to the extent of the north-south dialogue to see that how the common but differentiated responsibility are to find a place in the constitutional vision of all the country, especially in India. And then we see that either it is developed country or the developing country, they work in tandem to see the goals of sustainable development in matters of fresh water, in matters of marine environment, in matters of hazardous substances, in matters of nuclear safety, in matters of nature conservation and resources, should go hand in hand after the pronouncement of all international commitment, and to see that how environment and sustainable development can stem the rot of the poverty, disease, squalor, and gain a confidence of the people, and therefore the entire constitutional law and the enforceable right on the environment as a matter of international law as jus cogens, and in the domestic terms as a legal enforceable term, have created right to live in a healthy environment in Portugal, in Spain, and then in other countries like Switzerland, Greece, Papua New Guinea, and then we see that from phases from 1970 to 1982, 28 countries incorporated. In 1980s, that we see that more and more countries have started inserting the provision of the environmental conservation into their constitution, and after 1992, there has been a deeper movement to see that all countries are coming in terms to comparative constitutional law, or what you can say in the lecture we have tried to discuss about is the fact that how the environment protection and development in comparative constitutional practice, constitutional perspective, have well undergone to some massive changes in 1970s, in 1980s, and we have seen that it is now almost a customary that beside the jus cogens, the national jurisdictions and the national government have created a kind of atmosphere where right to environment and sustainable development finds a very respectable place in the very constitutional perspective of the different countries. With this, I think that any discussion on the constitution and environment, this introductory lecture will go a long way in understanding in a very holistic and a global perspective. With this, dear learner and viewer, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.